Good evening. Welcome to another version of Shifting Landscapes. This is the third in the racism series or topic. First 2 weeks we were dealing with Confederate monuments, and this week we are dealing with, let's say, women and their role in white supremacy, starting with the South and then moving north. It should be an interesting evening, I hope, for all of you. I want to just do my usual thank yous to everyone, especially our dear funders, which is the Michigan Humanities, I always want to say commission, they used to be MHC or council, and then the Michigan Council for Cultural Arts and Cultural Affairs. There we go. I usually have an easy time rolling that off, but not tonight. They both have funded us really nicely, and so we're able to do this and to pay folks, and it's a grand thing, we think. And we also just simply want to say thank you. Thanks to all of us as staff as well, because our tax dollars actually fund both the humanities and the arts. So thank you. This is produced by a team. Some of you are new, so just briefly, Kathy Organ is in the audience. Kathy is part of the focused on community. Thomas Trahey, he's in the back, technology, and he is the one who said race and racism is very important. Let's make sure we do it. Kathy Calabretta is online. Kathy was the one who said education is really important to me. Mike McKinney was our science person. He went away after a while because he got a very bad infection, but he started us off on the science. And Matt Sanderson also got ill during the pandemic period, but he was Truth in Politics, which we will start next month. And I'll make that little advertising note. Know that next Monday we do not have an event, and then we'll start up again March 7, 14, and 21, just like this month. So handouts, please read when you get home. You'll probably find resonance in, I've used a quote from Elizabeth Gillespie McRae, her book itself, just talking about what we Northerners picked up from the South when it came time for integration in our midst. So what's the connection between last week and this week? Well, there's some odd connection, but first let me go very directly. The Confederate monuments, though we didn't say a thing about the women the last 2 weeks, were highly instrumental in them. What we focused on in the first 2 weeks, because we live here in the North and most of us had no trucking with Confederate monuments and where they came from, so we focused, as you know, on who were they about, and what did they have to say? Why did people in the South make monuments of them? And so we did John C. Calhoun, who died before the Civil War, but he was monumentalized after Reconstruction, during that post-Reconstruction period. So it was really, so we focused on that. We focused on those ideas. But the women were the ones, after the Northerners left from Reconstruction, who said, we need to help our men heal. They felt like, you said a 21st century term, losers. They lost the war, and many of them had lost a lot of their livelihood. And the women wanted to help them regain their own vitality and sense of themselves, and monuments were a way of doing that. So they had a tremendous role. In time, and this is all from Karen Cox's book, No Common Ground, in time the women gave over their roles to the men, and they continued to do a lot of the monumentalizing, as I kind of describe it. So there was a role that women played. When we were looking at race and racism, actually what came up a lot for our third session was stuff about men, about white men, especially about Midwestern men. But it was all very complicated. It's new research. It's about how they are dying more rapidly than any other group, especially 25 to 55-year-olds, and those who are not educated through college. So they have either now in this 21st century, low-paying jobs, no jobs, and that is why they think that they are committing suicide or deaths from despair, which are from alcoholism or through drugs. But there wasn't enough to go on about how do we help. We just didn't want to go there. And we thought, okay, what else is out there? And there was nothing I could find on women. And then I came upon Elizabeth's book. And it's here. It's Mothers of Massive Resistance, and it's women's role in the white power movement. And I hope you pick it up either through mel.org or from a bookstore. She's a beautiful writer. She is captivating. She is amazing to me. Also, look at some of the podcasts, and this is why she is also here tonight. She walks this terrain of talking to white women and talking to black women these days about the role of white women in black oppression. And she navigates it extremely well. She is not, I want to see what I wrote here. She neither soft pedals nor takes a righteous position. She tells the truth in multiple facets. And so you believe her, you don't get, I don't get angry at her. I want to listen. I want to understand the roles that we have had, Northern and Southern women, in the state that we are in. So with that, I want to introduce Elizabeth Gillespie McRae. She is a faculty member at, there we are, Western Carolina University. She is the Creighton Sossoman Associate Professor of History. She has been published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, World Histories, Public Schools First, and she does diverse radio shows and podcasts. Her current projects are the role of school choice in American public education, and she co-directs the Appalachian Oral History Project. You can see that her areas of academic excitement and passion are race, politics, education, and their intersection. Please help me welcome Elizabeth McRae to our stage.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brooke, for the invitation to Shifting Landscapes. And it's quite a lineup, and I'm honored to be part of it. So as Brooke said tonight, I'm going to talk to you about the historic work white women have done in sustaining and supporting racial segregation and white supremacist politics. And maybe in the endeavor of sort of thinking about where we are today and how we got there and how this history sort of helps us do that. So I'm going to shift back and forth from my PowerPoint. I hope it'll be seamless, but I'm not sure that it will be. So for much of American history and scholarship and in the public view, white supremacist politics, and I think Brooke alluded to this, has had a particular location, the South. It has had famous standard bearers, the KKK, a variety of strategies that included electing cigar smoking, bourbon drinking, white Southern politicians to the Senate, to Congress, to governor's houses, as well as vigilante violence. And there's also been clear markers when you think about sort of the history of this: white and black only signs, sheriffs with tear gas, lynchings, right? And all that is really important. But for the past 20 years, I think I've had questions about the centrality of these images in the persistence of white supremacist politics. Do they help us understand why white supremacist politics is so difficult to dislodge? Are these politics really, and the systems it creates, really the work of the disaffected? Or is it the work of those holding values outside of mainstream society rather than those inside it? If we could purge the swastika carrying, Confederate flag waving young men from public life, or particular virulent sort of leaders, would white supremacy wither on the vine? I don't think so. And I think for answers, we must turn to the less familiar, but I think no less important. And so I've got a few images. Let's see if I can do this. So sort of how did we get here? And sort of a retrospective on white women, racism, white supremacist politics, and segregation. Just got a couple images from recent era, and then one that goes back to the 1970s. So in my book, Mothers of Massive Resistance, I argue, and I'm gonna stop sharing this for right now. I argue that it was white women who staged a relentless, continual march of grassroots work, everyday mundane work in local communities to sustain racial segregation. They built political networks among female conservatives. They coordinated with national organizations. They affected local, state, and national elections, and they worked in things like PTA meetings. And their work orbited around and sometimes employed a vision of white women as sort of guardians of domestic life. But their vision of domestic life included not only homes and children and schools, but elections and campaigns and public libraries and public life in general. And they shaped how communities and their neighbors and their friends and their children understood white motherhood, history, current and international events, public schools, sex and marriage, Black resistance, and their own families. So and much of this work was done on a really local level. So they may not have been the most visible public faces of the Jim Crow order, but they were sort of segregation's constant gardeners. And in this talk, I'm not talking about all white women. I'm mostly focused on the white women that produced, right, that worked really hard over the decades to instill and sustain and shape racial segregation. And so for the sake of sort of moving through the talk, when I say white women, I'm really talking about these segregationist white women that were committed to sort of sustaining and shaping a vision of citizenship, of their communities, of the nation, that was built on a racial hierarchy. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later. So this talk will be sort of in two parts. The first part is gonna look at particular campaigns in the interwar periods. So from the moment women get the right to vote in 1920 through sort of World War II, right? So that 1920 to 1940, 1945. And I'm gonna give you examples from sort of how public welfare was married to this campaign for segregation, how white women shaped public education, electoral politics, and a larger, I call Jim Crow storytelling or sort of cultural politics. Then I'll show you a few slides about some of the things I talked about. I'll answer a couple questions, and then we'll move on to part two. And in part two, I look at sort of the period after World War II through the anti-busing campaigns of the 70s. And I hope in those examples, you'll see how white women were working in all these sort of four areas to resist the march of racial equality, to resist the civil rights movement, to resist Black grassroots mobilization. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. Okay, so the first story I'm going to talk to you about focuses on white women as public welfare workers in Virginia. So in the 1920s, right, we witnessed with the 19th Amendment, the entrance of women into electoral politics, to formal sort of political spheres. And at the same time, there's lots else going on, but it's also a movement for eugenics and sterilization, right, that's nationwide. And so women come onto the political stage in the midst of this movement. And during the 1920s, eugenics was supported by folks who were really interested in maintaining social order of white over Black. And the Virginia state legislature passed the most restrictive racial integrity law in the nation. which you might hear referred to as kind of the one-drop rule. So in 1924, the state legislature in Virginia, after campaigns by various constituent organizations, passed a law that said there were only sort of two racial classifications in Virginia. You were either Black or you were white. And if you had any Black or Native American ancestors, right, the one drop, right, you moved into the Black category. And so to be white, you had to have a genealogy that was, except with one exception, we'll talk about that later, that was white. And this, in part, was to make the Jim Crow line, right, to make racial segregation easier to enforce. And it was also to prevent passing. So there's this obsession in the 20s, and it's not just in the South, we see it in Harlem Renaissance writers, with the notion of passing, right? People whose lineages was such that they would pass permanently as white, they would pass during the day to get jobs as white, and then return to Black communities. And so there was this obsession that sort of people were passing and breaking the laws of racial segregation. Anyway, so this law required that the state and its workers gaze into the most intimate spaces of family life, right? Interrogating the marriage bed, being figuratively there at the moment of conception, literally there as midwives at the moment of birth, but to make the law work, right, to ferret out people who were claiming to be white and weren't, it required local people to commit, right? It's a law that simply could not work without local workers. And so Virginia's sort of bureaucrats turned to white women. The midwife, the school teacher, the social worker, the local registrar who was registering people to vote or signing marriage licenses. And in communities, they called on them to shore up whiteness by policing genealogies and bedrooms and births, by intruding and cataloging and describing behaviors. And women were central to this. One, right, they were the threat to the system, right? White women, through interracial liaisons, could threaten racial integrity. But at the same time, leading scientists in the nation, eugenicists that were at Cold Springs Harbor, New York, had called on young white women to come and be trained because they believed that women had some kind of germplasm that allowed them to recognize sort of innately race mixing. And so white women are trained in New York to go out and sort of hold the color line across the nation. So how did they do this, right? Sometimes the state would pay you, right, by voter registration or by birth certificates that you issued and sent people to the courthouse, right, would pay you to do that, sort of like egg money. They called on school teachers to look out across their classrooms and think about and try to catalog the students who were in there and let state officials know if they were passing. They asked nurses, right, to make sure that people that were being treated in white hospitals were white. And they called on college students. So at Sweetbriar College, a sociology professor who was part of this eugenics sort of research community asked his social work students, all young women, to go out and conduct interviews about this mixed race population in Amherst and Rockbridge County, Virginia. So those of you that are, this is near Lexington, Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Virginia, that area. And there was a group of people that had, were not hidden, that local knowledge said had come, right, with white settlers who brought their Native American and African, either enslaved or free wives, and those communities had thrived in these particular places. For those of you that are familiar with Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, this is where Jake and Sing came from. In that novel. So these young students, right, 19, 20, young students at Sweetbriar, under their professor's direction, went out and went into the homes of in these mixed race communities. And they took notes on the conditions of their homes, on the color of the skin, on cleanliness, on work ethic, on academic aptitude. It was not very scientific, even though it was under the auspices of social science. Comments on complexion slid into assessment of behaviors. So, for example, one student reported that Bessie Jones had black hair and dark brown eyes, but light skin. She was a very poor mentality, is unindustrious, shiftless, and permits her home to become so littered that one can scarcely walk across the floor. Others invoked racial stereotypes about Black sexuality, suggesting that the young girls that lived in this community became boy crazy at the age of 9, 10, or 11, and then the next few years became more or less promiscuous, generally with younger boys of the vicinity. Teachers at the school in this area contributed key evidence for these eugenics researchers and the Jim Crow crusade by articulating the sort of suspect character of their non-white students. And in 1926, this research, done after the passage of the Racial Integrity Act, was published in a book called Mongrel Virginians. You can check it out at the library, maybe not your library. Using the stories collected by women's social work students, the authors noted that the sexual relations of this group of people were on a very low plane, quote, almost that of an animal. Other findings articulated that this group was biologically and socially inferior, and this shaped the lives of 550 Virginians. The research that the social work students did meant the hardening of the color line. It meant that generations of families would be denied access to public services. And it meant that Native Americans struggling to get the right to vote and federal recognition would face a bureaucratic erasure. On an individual level, these families targeted by the law had few options. Many left and moved to Maryland. Others bought whiteness certificates that were peddled by those seeking to make dollars from other people's misery. And across the nation, anti-miscegenation laws and one-drop rules proliferated. Over 42 states would pass them. In California, social workers also trained at Cold Spring Harbor would do the same kind of things these Virginia students were doing. And we saw juvenile incarceration rates and sterilization increase. For whatever reason that these women had participated in this for some extra money, right, because the experts recommended it, to move up the ladder as state employees, because they were committed white supremacists, they used the state and the positions in it to give shape to racial segregation on the ground. And in this way, the Racial Integrity Act institutionalized some of the authority, or made formal some of the authority women had had in their communities over education, over public health, over childbirth. And so this expanding bureaucracy born of the progressive era had created a new position and a new way for white women to affect public policy. And it had bureaucratized white supremacy when legislation was translated into local practice by these sort of female foot soldiers. So that's like how public welfare in the 1920s in this one particular place became central to the reign of Jim Crow. The second story is about public schools, which were also a forum for instituting white supremacist education. So Mildred Lewis Rutherford was a UDC member, which Brooke referred to. She led a school, the Lucy Cobb Institute, which was in Athens, Georgia. She was a writer. She was a leader of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which were central in sort of funding and building Confederate statues all over the country. And she charged in the 1920s what Southern whites was shoring up textbook narratives in a way that would uphold racial segregation. So rather than thinking about the past and the Confederacy, right, as sort of some sort of ameliorative campaign, she focused on education in a way to ensure that the system of racial segregation and white supremacist politics would reinforce itself in the next generation, would be passed on. So how did she do this? First, and this is a little wonky, but I'll try to make it quick, and if you have questions about it later. The South, which was behind in public education, behind every other region in the country, was ahead in having state textbook selection committees. And these state textbook selection committees in the 1920s adopted, right, they chose the textbooks that would be used statewide. And Mildred Rutherford had worked to get state textbook selection committees established in Georgia, and UDC members had worked in other states to do that. And then she encouraged white women to conduct textbook censorship campaigns and to lobby the committee to purge particular books that went against the history that she wanted taught. So for example, she had a list, right, that was disseminated both through her publication and in UDC meetings and in Confederate veteran meetings that said, you wanted to get rid of textbooks that talked about slavery as anything other than a school for civilizing Africans. That you wanted textbooks that called the Civil War the war between the states, and that referred to enslaved people as servants. And you wanted a system that talked about the separation of white and Black as sort of natural. And then she encouraged the UDC to sponsor essay contests in high school about Confederate heroes, about states' rights. She encouraged the UDC, and they did, to fund teacher training, to participate in local school politics. She had her own publication called Miss Rutherfords Scrapbook that was a periodical sponsored by national publishing houses. Well, not sponsored, but they advertised in her periodical, where she disseminated her own list of banned phrases for white readers to watch out for. And she advanced in the UDC, and the women that worked with her advanced a powerful historical narrative that privileged the experience of white Confederates and worked to obscure white Southern culpability in the institution of slavery. So what happened? So the textbooks actually got whiter than they had in the 19th century. So Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the founder of the KKK, but in the Civil War had conducted a massacre at Fort Pillow of Black soldiers, Union soldiers who were surrendering, he disappears. That story disappears from the textbook. Harriet Tubman, who'd been in the textbooks in the 1880s, disappears from the textbooks. And the publishing houses helped this along because for them, it made good economic sense to win the contracts of an entire state by lobbying one committee. Right? And so what happened is the national publishing houses did a sort of financial calculus, and it made sense to follow, right, the dictates of these Southern textbook selection committees. And so soon the nation's textbooks, sort of like Texas and California function today in determining textbook narratives. So soon the nation's textbooks reflected the very things Mildred Lewis Rutherford had hoped that they would. How effective was this? In the 1930s, the Mississippi Educational Association, an association of white teachers, surveyed the textbooks. And if a student read every single textbook in every single subject in all the grades, kindergarten through 12th grade, they would never meet one single African-American by name who contributed to American life. And given that the South controlled the nation's textbook narratives, this was as likely true in Michigan or California as it was in Mississippi. And so what we have is a public school curriculum affected, right, by some really politically savvy white women that offered an education for the nation in Jim Crow citizenship. Okay, the third story is about electoral politics. So we have women working in public welfare, we have women working in public education, and of course women had the right to vote and enter sort of partisan politics in a more formal way than they had prior to suffrage. And white segregationist women worked to reshape the Democrat and Republican parties to be more ideologically in line with a harder sort of white over Black view. They believed, some of these white segregationist activists, that women were more effective in partisan politics and in reshaping the Democrat and Republican Party because they were largely out of the patronage and committee assignments that came with the particular things you did for the party, right, that were granted to party operatives. They were more ideologically pure, these segregationist women argued. And so I'll give you two sort of quick examples. In the piney woods of Mississippi, so South Mississippi, not the Delta, a newspaper woman, Mary Dawson Kane, she ran her own newspaper, was a beautiful writer, tried to move white Mississippians during the 1930s out of the Democratic Party. And this was very difficult. Mississippi was big D Democrat, like the Democratic Party. They were the most, after South Carolina, they're the most Democratic state in the nation in the 1930s. Huge, right, advocates of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And so Mary Dawson Kane adopts this position of moving white Mississippians out of the Democratic Party in the midst of the New Deal, right? She's a conservative among conservatives. And she originally had supported FDR, but when Congress began debating anti-lynching legislation in the late 1930s, and when Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR had cultivated a kind of black cabinet, right, a series of black advisors, Kane saw the sort of writing on the wall, and she believed that federal control over workers and also the threat of black electoral participation was a bridge too far. So she contended, right, that women needed to sort of hold the line. And she began to reject the label of Democrat, right? She said, I'm not a New Deal Democrat, I'm not a Roosevelt Democrat, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a Jeffersonian Democrat. And the reason she chose Thomas Jefferson is that he had espoused states' rights, right? And so she could adopt this hardline states' rights view. She built, voter by voter, a very small group of supporters in Mississippi. But she kept at it. And by the 1950s, she had a national following of hardcore conservatives from Idaho, from California, from Washington State, from Massachusetts, from Texas, et cetera. They're folders of her correspondence from all 50 states. In the South, she was also joined by a South Carolina woman from Charleston, Cornelia Dabney Tucker. And Tucker, too, was a hardcore anti-New Dealer. And her strategy was, she became a Republican in South Carolina in the late 1930s. She wanted to shift the Republican Party, which was known as a black and tan party, a party that had sort of, that was an interracial party in the South in the 1930s, very small, but an interracial party. She wanted the Republican Party to be lily white. She conducted an anti-court-packing campaign when FDR argued for expanding the court. And again, her position's wildly unpopular, right? The South had the most support for court packing, right? Because so many of the New Deal programs had brought a measure of sort of financial security to one of the poorest regions of the country. So Tucker leaves the Democratic Party, she becomes a Republican, and she lobbies nationwide she creates a nationwide coalition against court packing and begins a national sort of campaign to pressure South Carolina to get a secret ballot. So in South Carolina, until 1952, when you walked into the polls, you said, okay, I need the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot. You could not vote a split ballot. And Tucker, in moving the South away, the white South away from the Democratic Party, wanted people to be able to vote for a Republican presidential candidate and Democratic state officials. So you needed to have a secret ballot. She won't win that fight until 1952. But when she does win it, she and Mary Dawson Kane are part of a group called Democrats for Eisenhower that campaigned for white Southern Democrats to vote for Dwight Eisenhower for president in 1952. Okay. In Mississippi, Eisenhower does not win. He does win in Keynes County, right? Tucker pushed again. He doesn't win in Charleston, but Eisenhower gets more votes than a Republican candidate had in a long while. And so by 1952, these sort of partisan efforts of hardline segregationist women, right, had begun to realign the nation's political parties and realign the white South's votes for that. So that's electoral politics. So finally, the last sort of story of the interwar period is about Jim Crow storytelling. right? So if we're working on all these realms, it's also important that the stories that are being told in public in the South reinforce racial segregation. And here I'm going to talk to you really briefly about a woman named Nell Battle Lewis, who I argue is a liberal white supremacist, and you can decide whether I'm right on that or not. But Nell Battle Lewis had gone to school, well educated, gone to Smith College, been overseas in World War I, had come back to Raleigh, was a flapper, was the first woman hired full-time at the Raleigh News and Observer. And the Raleigh News and Observer proclaimed itself to be sort of the most progressive Southern newspaper. She was an iconoclast on many issues. She campaigned against the KKK, right, which was incredibly powerful nationwide in the 1920s. She was against capital punishment. She supported textile workers. She supported their communist allies. She called for reform in the justice and penal system. She earned the reputation in national periodicals of being kind of a Southern radical, but her columns also upheld a world of enlightened whites and deferential blacks. Inequality was real. She believed it was ordained, right? It just needed to be properly managed by the most educated, most enlightened, and most progressive white folks. So to reinforce this in her columns, she decried the Klan, but also celebrated. She wrote multiple columns about mammies, about Black domestic servants, about shoe shiners. She celebrated Black spirituals and Black working class culture. She condemned violence, but she held that African Americans deserved a subservient but safe place in Southern society. When there was a textile strike in Gastonia, there was an interracial textile strike. She was there. She knew African Americans were organizing with the working class whites in the South. She wrote national columns about the strike. Now, she wanted the strikers to win, so she knew she couldn't highlight their interracial organizing. But the other reason she did not highlight the interracial organizing of the strikers in 1929 in Gastonia is she didn't believe that working class folks should be in charge of the sort of racial equality campaigns in the South. She believed that people like her, right, really educated, progressive, enlightened, should be at the sort of hydraulics of change, right? They should control those. And so what she did through her columns, in addition to like celebrating Black spirituals and not, and condemning sort of Black productions of Shakespeare, she also erased a history of interracial organizing in the South. And so what we're left with is a white and working class, right, that becomes the sort of repository of ideas about white supremacy and violent segregationist. And that mantra sort of remains today, right? In effect, erasing some of the women that perpetuated this order. So I'm going to go for just a few minutes and show you some images about some of the last things that I've talked about. And I'm happy if Brooke wants to pose some questions, or if someone has a question that she wants to ask. And so here, let me go. Okay, so this is the copy of the card that was the birth certificate that was made as part of the Racial Integrity Act. So you can see, right, that color has to be written, and the asterisk says, right, a white person is one with no trace of whatever of blood of another race, except if you said that you had 1/16 of American Indian, and that's because some of the wealthiest and most powerful white families in Virginia had said they were descendants of Pocahontas, and so this was like the Pocahontas clause. But this is what midwives were asked to fill out, and if they didn't fill them out right, and many did not, right, many refused to follow this, then they were threatened, right, with action by the state. See if I can, okay. This is a picture from the scrapbook of the sociology professor. This is the student investigators that went into the communities. This is the book that was, the cover of the book that was published. the WIN tribes. WIN stood for White, Indian, and Negro at that time. This is one of the issues of the Mildred Lewis Rutherford's periodical. Here's Mary Dawson Kane. This is a little later, right? She runs for governor of Mississippi in 1952 as a true conservative and as a Jeffersonian Democrat. Here's pictures of the Gastonia strikers. As you can tell, it's all the white strikers. The African-American leaders were whisked out of Charlotte pretty quickly to avoid a more violent punishment. And here's Nelvattle Lewis. She was also a school teacher for several years at St. Mary's School in Raleigh. Are there any questions?
Do folks in the audience have a question? I don't see any on chat yet. That one is my question to the group. Elizabeth, maybe I can just start one that I realize now my history is failing me, because when was The Lost Cause written? And now I'm thinking it probably developed over time. And so the person you were talking about, you know, of wanting all the textbooks to do what I would call the Lost Cause version of the Civil War, how did those two things mesh?
Well, I mean, she was older by the 1920s, right? And so she had been sort of enmeshed in these campaigns, right? So the early campaigns were to get pensions, right? To get federal pensions for Confederate soldiers. So that was one of the first sort of campaigns. Then the second sort of wave, and it's not always in this order, right, was about this commemoration, these reunions that were held of both Union and Confederate soldiers that the UDC worked on, this monument building. And so that's all part of the Lost Cause that begins to take shape really in the 1880s and 1890s, and then sort of gains speed, right, in the early decades of the 20th century. But the textbooks weren't really about the Lost Cause. I mean, it's pretty clear that what they wanted to make sure is that the next generation understood how to uphold racial segregation. So I think so often we've looked at these women as sort of frozen, right, in this sort of 19th century Civil War time, but Mildred Lewis Rutherford's periodical and textbook were very forward. Her gaze was to the future in this endeavor, not the past. But yeah, it's all wrapped up in some of that.
Fascinating,
But I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, the textbooks weren't about the Lost Cause in particular, I don't think. There are others that disagree with me.
And would you, I also realize perhaps some haven't heard of the Lost Cause, and just state briefly what was the Lost Cause?
It was sort of a romanticization of the Confederate effort in the Civil War, right? That this was not about slavery, it was about states' rights, and these were honorable men fighting for like their people and their home states, right? Not against the U. I mean, it really was a rehabilitation of what was, you know, a treasonous war, frankly, like fighting to tear the Union apart, right? And instead, the sort of Lost Cause reshaped them. It talked about the nation being invested in slavery, not just the South.
Okay.
And so it was this sort of historic rehabilitation.
Thanks. There is a question online, and the question is, can you go into more detail about the black strikers allied with the whites? I got confused about how long they worked together, how and when it fell apart.
So the 1929 strike that I was talking about went on for several months, started in April, right? It was not successful. It was nationally notable because the South is historically anti-union, right? And the textile workers, the textile mills in the South were segregated. So except for janitorial work, for the most part, all the workers were white, right? And white women, in fact, were the first sort of wave of textile workers in the South. And so many of the Black organizers came as part of the National Textile Workers Union, right? So came as national union representatives. And they moved into the strikers' communities. Some of them conducted sing-alongs together, right? They worked with the strikers. If the NTWU was going to support the Southern strikers, they had to sort of agree not to sort of uphold the color line. So there weren't a ton of Black workers that joined the strikers because the textile mills were pretty white in terms of its workforce, but there were union organizers. And in fact, and so the strike isn't successful. There's trials in August, right? So it starts in March or April. There's trials in August. A police chief is killed. Ella Mae Wiggins, who worked very closely with the two African-American organizers, is murdered. And all that is sort of over by September of 1929. So yeah, it's fleeting. It's not like a sustained, but it is a moment that you had sort of collaboration across the color line.
Okay. Are there any questions? I don't see any more online, and I don't see any hands going up here in the room. Okay.
Okay.
You can carry on. Thanks.
Okay, so the next sort of section, right, if we think about these four areas as places that women had worked, certainly before, but in my sort of work from the 1920s and 30s and into the 1940s. By the time World War II is drawing to an end, and some would argue even earlier, what we understand is the civil rights movement had begun to take shape, right? And the sort of Black organizing and Black mobilization, and there's some legal victories that desegregate graduate schools. The all-white primary is declared unconstitutional during World War II. The secret ballot and soldiers being able to vote, right, which allowed Black soldiers serving overseas to vote in their southern states because you couldn't keep a paper ballot away from the polls that was mailed in, right? There's all these sort of campaigns. The NAACP is coming to work in the South in greater numbers in World War II and right afterwards. And so these white women who had been working for decades for segregation see the sort of threats to racial segregation. And they sort of amp up their work. And historians have called this massive resistance, right? Massive resistance to racial segregation. And they have sort of focused on this time period. So I'm going to talk about a couple stories that sort of both are national in scope, and also bring together work in all the four places that I talked about in the interwar period in this sort of civil rights era. So the next few stories will highlight how sort of white women met these challenges of an escalating and intensifying civil rights movement in the period after World War II. And so the first one really combines Jim Crow storytelling and issues of public education and the concerns that public welfare workers had about sex and marriage. And they do it to demonize Eleanor Roosevelt. And so this is a through line among many sort of segregationist women. So given white women's sustained work in upholding racial segregation, they were particularly attentive to white women who did not uphold their duties, right? And Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, and then the ambassador to the United Nations in the post-war period, was a white woman that threatened the system. And for segregationists, right, to make matters worse, she cataloged this in her daily column called My Day. That white segregationist women are the ones that I wrote about followed sort of religiously. And so as sort of the post-war period took shape, Eleanor Roosevelt became sort of lightning rod for this kind of criticism. And so they attacked in newspapers, in talks, and at school programs, right, the First Lady for crossing the color line. And there was a Mississippi columnist named Florence Sellers Ogden. And like Nell Battle Lewis, she had a weekly column in a local paper, and soon it got taken up by the Jackson Clarion Ledger, which was Mississippi's statewide newspaper. And she was really concerned by Eleanor Roosevelt's racial politics. And so in 1942, Florence Sellers Ogden had noted in her column that Eleanor Roosevelt had attended graduation ceremonies for the Harlem hospital nurses. And afterward, Eleanor Roosevelt had written how she'd gone home with the nurses and had dinner. And Ogden claimed that Eleanor Roosevelt had violated the queenly condescension that guided white women's interactions with Black women and men. Interracial dining ranked high on the sense of race traders, higher than interracial sex. And in her dining, Eleanor Roosevelt had shaken, Ogden claimed, the foundation of racial segregation. This trend continued. So in 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt takes a train to Salisbury, North Carolina. She goes to several meetings, one at a Black university. That night she has to go home. Not one white family in Salisbury will host her, the First Lady. And in the same year, she attends the opening of a social club, a canteen for soldiers in Washington, D.C. And this was sponsored by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, so a national union, and Black and white soldiers. It was not a segregated space. And on the floor of Congress, a Louisiana congressman condemned the First Lady for promoting interracial dancing. And for weeks after, letters poured in from women and girls across the South, accusing Eleanor Roosevelt of advocating interracial sex and of being sexually frustrated herself. On a Tuesday, two 12-year-old girls wrote the First Lady from school, right, saying, while I usually do all my own thinking, which suggests that maybe this time she hadn't, what I think about white girls dancing and associating with the colored, and you're entertaining them at the White House, I am not able to put into words. Then she continued, this is 1943, anticipating changes that would happen decades later. I'll finish my education at home if I have to go to school with Black children. After World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt became the ambassador to the United Nations. And she pushed and advocated for the Human Rights Convention and the Genocide Convention. One, condemning genocide. The second, right, upholding sort of basic human rights that individuals across the globe should have and that the United Nations should guarantee. She was blasted for upending Southern segregation. And in fact, it would be white women that prevented the United States from accepting the Human Rights and Genocide Convention until Ronald Reagan was president. Even Nixon wanted the Congress to ratify the Human Rights and Genocide Convention, and the campaign of white women stopped it. Phyllis Schlafly was a leader. This was one of her early kind of political training grounds, was this anti-human rights campaign. Some white women said that the conventions that Eleanor Roosevelt supported would permit the rape of white women by Black men, and then prevent their punishment because it would be a human rights violation. But that was less common, right? And the DAR and the UDC supported this anti-human rights, so the Daughters of American Revolution, supported this anti-human rights stance. The more frequent story, and this circulated across the nation, was that what the UN meant for Southern communities and Western communities was this, that, quote, a Negro, a Chinese, or a member of a racial minority could insult you or your daughter. Your husband might shoot him, knock him down, or cuss him out. If so, he could be tried in an international court. It would also make it a crime to prevent interracial marriage. and intermarriage would destroy the white race, which has brought Christianity to the world. So women circulated this, members of the American Bar Association circulated the story, and like the women in Virginia 20 years earlier, it was interracial marriage, not sexual violence, that they most feared, right? That would bring racial equality. So this Jim Crow storytelling about Eleanor Roosevelt ginned up lots of opposition to the United Nations. Segregationist women would campaign against trick-or-treating for UNICEF. They said that was a communist plot. They campaigned against multicultural education. That was an early curriculum disseminated by the United Nations. But more importantly, I think for us, is that the focus on Eleanor Roosevelt, well, not more importantly, but as important, made civil rights agitation the work of white women. And it hid for decades the work by Black women, men, and children in Black communities across the South and nation to end racial segregation. Right, by focusing on Eleanor Roosevelt as the person that was creating sort of the landscape for racial equality, was its own kind of white supremacist victory, right? Because it erased Black activism. And this was sort of the logic of white female segregationists, right? That whites, outside agitators, were causing civil rights agitation. It wasn't the NAACP. It wasn't Sojourners for the Truth. It wasn't the Chicago Defender. It wasn't grassroots leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer. It was white women who weren't doing their job. So you can see like how important they thought this sort of Jim Crow education was. The Brown decision made this harder to do, right? In 1954, when the Supreme Court issued the decision that said Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal was no longer constitutional, right? The headlines across the nation sort of erupted, and Black families in the segregated South readied their children to go to integrated schools. And so no longer, it made it really hard to talk about civil rights activism and ignore actual Black activists. The response to the Brown decision was also grassroots. So in North Carolina, a woman from the East Coast, a white woman named Mrs. Hugh Bell, wrote a letter in the immediate aftermath saying that she opposed school integration to the paper. She wrote a letter because she wanted to protect her two daughters. And if there was any doubt who they needed protected from, she continued that maybe it will take a little violence. And she glibly noted that it was too bad about the murder of that 14-year-old Negro boy, and she's referring to Emmett Till. She worked with other segregationists across the state in the immediate, so that letter comes a little later after the first Brown decision. It comes after the second, after Brown 2. But the first Brown decision, she works with people across the state to petition the governor, right, to not desegregate the schools. And in the first 3 months, and this is without social media and without the internet, she gets 80,000, they get 80,000 signatures. Right. Bell also distributes a report across, not a report that she wrote, but a report that gets widespread dissemination across North Carolina that noted the fears of white women that their white daughters would marry someone else's Black sons, that academics would suffer under integration because of the low achievement and intellect of Black youth, and that the high sex drives of Black boys would diminish the school environment. They imagined that desegregated schools would be hothouses for consensual sex, this is a quote, and breeding grounds for marriage between whites and Blacks. And they worried that the Black teacher would subvert decades of work in teaching white supremacy, in securing textbooks that minimized Black achievement, and in shaping curriculum that highlighted white paternalism. If white segregationist women could not counter the Supreme Court's decision to put white and Black children together in schools, they could reshape the curriculum, they were pretty sure. And across the nation, white women amped up their efforts to fight racial equality through the curriculum. It would be Los Angeles where they achieved their greatest victory. A group of well-organized parents claimed that multiculturalism being taught in the Los Angeles and Pasadena schools was an attack on American values. They forced the resignation of an internationally renowned school superintendent because he had advocated the showing of a short film called The Brotherhood of Man. He had worked on the multicultural curriculum that came out of the United Nations. They said he sanctioned the erosion of American exceptionalism and the dilution of the reputation of white American founding fathers. They also attacked him for offering summer programs that they said eroded maternal authority, and also for ending busing, because in Los Angeles in 1955, they wanted to bus their children out to maintain segregated schools, and Gosselin had suggested that busing should stop. This was not just in Los Angeles. In Mississippi, there were banned textbook exhibitions. There were essay contests about the benefits of racial segregation, and students won $500 apiece. In 1960, that would have paid for 4 years of college education at the University of Mississippi. And segregationists across the nation began to call for public funds to be used for a portion to pay for private education, foreshadowing an argument that would be used today for charter schools of taxpayers' dollars being used to serve exclusive, not inclusive publics. But the 1960s handed defeat after defeat to segregationist women. And they began to shift away in the South from an overtly racist political language. They had tried this out before, and this shift will be pretty complete in the 1960s. Instead, they adopted a colorblind political discourse, and they invoked family values more and more as a justification for their political actions. In 1962, white Southern women formed the Women for Constitutional Government, a pretty innocuous name, right? They distributed reading lists that were free of liberal internationalizing propaganda. They celebrated mothers of school children, and they told women that they would have to uphold real conservative values because white men had abdicated their responsibility. The racial component, they contended, was just one factor in the larger disease of a behemoth federal government that reached into everyday life. School integration was not about white supremacy. It was about parental choice and the right to school choice. These women also predicted in 1962 that when integration came to northern and western cities, that people would behave in much the same way they did. And they were proved correct. 10 years later, this prediction came true as stories of protest against busing filled the nation's newspapers. And it featured places not like Mississippi, but Boston, Louisville, Pontiac, and Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The actors that took to the streets in these northern and western cities were not part of the KKK. They did not call themselves segregationists. They were white women involved in home and school associations. They emphasized, these activists, that they were unlike Southern segregationists. But it is hard to look at their work and discern much difference. They invoked a language of academic difference. They said busing eroded their powers as mothers. They stood outside playgrounds and yelled at Black and white children. They put flyers up in high schools. They named their organization Restore Our Alienated Rights in Boston. Meanwhile, Black Bostonians chanted, "It's not the bus, it's us," reminding these activists who they were really worried about. White women took to the streets, they marched on City Hall, and they said what they believed in was choice. School choice became the clarion cry for those seeking to avoid school desegregation in the North and West. Rather than calling them segregationists, historians have followed their lead, separating the actions of Northern and Western white women from the actions of their Southern segregationist sisters, arguing that their politics were about family values in a way that Southern segregationist women's were not. This was a national political story by the 1970s and one that buried white supremacist politics behind homeowner interests, parental rights, and family values. So what do we do with this now? Facing the public resurgence of white supremacist politics, how might these stories better equip us to challenge this reach? So I have 4 sort of suggestions. I think we can realize that the persistence of white supremacist politics and white women's roles in reproducing it was and is not new. We must stop being surprised about this strand of women's politics. It did not begin after the Brown decision, did not end in 1965. It doesn't reside simply in laws and violence, and its geography is larger than we might want. The story of women's political mobilization in the 20th century is a story both of liberal women's political mobilization and of segregationist mobilization. Second, I think their work reminds us that inequality is shaped by the daily actions and daily life in homes, schools, and our communities. It's shaped by the stories we tell, and it is in those places that folks who want a more equitable society must counter, right, the long-term efforts of segregationists if we are to meet the promise of equality. Third, that the presence of women workers offers us an opportunity to shift our historical focus. So often the story of racial segregation has been dominated by those white supremacists who held political office or who committed violent, heinous acts that made it onto the television screen. When they are eliminated, what remains is a system without workers. I'm going to be really quick because I want to be able to answer folks' questions. But like, what does this history do for us? I think the first thing, right, is that we have to realize that white supremacist politics is diverse and ever-changing, right, and reproduces itself, and it shape-shifts. And in part of the reason it does that is it's rooted in local activists in local communities, right? And many of those historically have been women. Second, while we shouldn't ignore the violence of white supremacist politics, that I think women, white women segregationists suggest that we should look at daily actions and daily lives in our homes and schools and communities. And it's those places that the struggle must go if we are to meet the promise of equality. Third, I think the presence of women allows us to shift our historical focus, right? And one of the sort of ways the narrative has been told is when we got rid of, right, these terrible white governors and the murderers of civil rights activists, and we passed this legislation, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, that the sort of civil rights movement had come to an end. I think, again, if we look at white women's work in local communities, that we realize that that work still continued. The workers just weren't the same workers that had sort of dominated the national headlines. And finally, I think there's mounds of historical evidence that suggest, right, that we should expand our definition of politics. And I think that in this moment, we probably don't have to do that. We understand that a lot of political fights are rooted in sort of well up from school board meetings and PTA meetings and garden clubs and county commissioner meetings. And at those levels, white women have been really involved in that. White women have women have a diverse set of politics. And just because you're a mother doesn't mean you care about everyone else's children. And so that sort of idea, the biological essentialism that has shaped discussions about a woman's vote and make us surprised when white women support some really damaging politics. I think that it's time for that sort of to be over. So white women's work reminds us, right, that if we're going to create a more equitable society, we have to go to the places where white supremacist politics was cultivated and fed, and those are the places that white women lead us to. Thank you. And I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There is a question on chat, and I'll read that while folks here live think about their questions. So this is Margot Haynes asking, please describe some of the struggles you may have had, one, with students who, because of narrow education and backgrounds, may strongly resist your narratives, and two, with old school Southern colleagues where you have taught. It's a lot of talk here that is interested in this question and your answer.
Yeah, so I think my students. So I teach in a school that's probably a lot of first generation college students. They're more conservative than not. I think one of the differences of teaching in the South, though, is that there's no real, particularly in a historic sense, right? Like if I'm talking about the present for sure, but in ability, right? The students here, right, would not, aren't going to defend slavery. They understand what racial segregation, the inequities that it produced. And so I think I don't get pushback on that so much among my students. Pushback on other things for sure, and certainly when you get to the present, but I think in terms of a historical narrative, and in some ways it comes from maybe not a great place too. The students are happy in a kind of twisted way to realize that there's white supremacists other places, right? And they see that as sort of an apology for where they are, and that I think is really detrimental. So an old school Southern colleagues, I think they probably, maybe I don't have any old school Southern colleagues. I think among historians, right, I haven't gotten pushback, and among my department. And right, I probably would get pushback if I went to like a Confederate veterans meetings, but they haven't asked me, so I haven't gone. So I think that interestingly, when the book came out, the most sort of vehement opposition I got was from Boston, from women in Boston, who wrote some pretty nasty emails. Not many, right? So that's not, yeah.
Wow, from Boston, all right.
All right, they don't want to be segregationist. They want to be different, right, than, even though they asked George Wallace to come teach them how to campaign, but.
Others have questions?
You talked about the women's role in education. What role did religion play in this?
Yeah, so that's a really good critique, actually, of my work, right? I think I don't deal with religion much. And part of it is, I think the women that I wrote about were also dissatisfied with their religious communities, right? The women that were producing these politics. I think also this is before, right? My book ends in the decade before we see white fundamentalist Christianity go political, right? So for most of the period I write about, the people we would associate with Christian nationalism and sort of these politics today emerging out of a particular strand of Christianity. Evangelicals until Jerry Falwell and that sort of era, right, we're supposed to be outside of politics, right? Politics was dirty and immoral, and so you should avoid politics. So I think the sort of strand we see in white supremacist politics today of Christian nationalism I'm sure was there like in the Klan and in the far right, but in sort of mainstream Christianity, you didn't have that set of politics articulated by evangelicals in the same sort of way that we'll see come with Reagan and come with the 1980s. And so I think the Southern women I wrote about were dissatisfied with their churches, who they found were moving towards integration at a level that they thought should be resisted. So Christian nationalism and white supremacist politics is sort of a different book. Kevin Cruz has written a lot about this, and he'd be really good to read about this sort of later period, post-1970.
Okay, because I think, Michael, you have the same question, and so has Elizabeth answered it, or do you have another angle on it? This is a chat person, because he asked you to speak on the role of Christian nationalism in the perpetuation of segregation, so that's on people's minds here. So
there is, so I will add this, like the women that I wrote about and that sort of populate my book are sort of, they're mainstream, right? I mean, Mary Dawson Kane will be far right by the end, but Linda Gordon has written about women of the far right, where I think you would find like the Mothers Movement in World War II, where you would find kind of Christian nationalism and fascism and white supremacy all wrapped up together. And so I think for the period that I'm writing about, that you would look to women of the far right rather than sort of the middle, right? From sort of mainstream political actors. And so Glenn Jensen is another one that has written about women on the far right and sort of Christian nationalist iconography that is in that group.
does your
Sort
own,
of a,
oh,
sorry.
I was going to say, does your own, are you, let's say, I was going to say, does your own research take you into the late 20th, early 21st century, or do you think that you're on to, you know, the different topics, let's say the public school, public education kinds of things, or are you continuing it?
Yeah, so, I mean, I hope that my next book, if I live long enough to complete it, will be not sort of part 3 of this, but I think you certainly see school choice and parental choice, and that will push me up into the present. I'm imagining that the last chapter of the research project I'm working on will be about the charter school movement in North Carolina in the first decade of this century. And so I think that movement and the sort of role of evangelical Christianity will be impossible to avoid, right, in the sort of issue of public schooling and school choice and parental choice. So there will be some comments. I mean, I'm interested, you know, interested in what you said, these intersections. So I think there'll be some commonalities, but right, this book is sort of the lead up to the new right, like in women's roles and sort of shifting the political landscape. I think there's a number of other people that have written probably better than I can on the new right itself.
Okay. I don't see any more online at the moment. Anybody else have questions? Do you have a, no? All right. Well, I think that's our discussion. Oh, wait a minute. You haven't talked much about sexism these women may have encountered.
Yeah, so in an interesting way, right, certainly these women in many ways were far more accomplished than sort of male elected officials that they worked with. were studious, had prodigious work ethics. I mean, Mary Dawson Kane publishes her own newspaper in Southern Mississippi, and it has a national following, right, of the far right. So I think, like, in a more equitable time period, these women would have moved in to much more sort of public political roles. However, sexism also gave them room to work, right? The sort of prevailing ideas about women in politics, particularly among their white male counterparts, allowed them to do work in places, right, that didn't grab the sort of attention. And so I think that there was space for them. I will say that it's an interesting thread in the anti-busing campaigns. There's a real class component to that, right? So in Boston, it's 2 working class neighborhoods that become the first neighborhoods that are integrated. And in residential segregation and class segregation in the cities, many middle class white women avoided that, right? That their neighborhoods were not the neighborhoods that were integrated by busing. And so what you have is working class women who are saying this is a feminist issue and that the feminist movement has abandoned us. And so they felt, right, like the sort of the politics that were supposed to counter sexism, right, in fact, did not offer them, did not embrace what they saw as sort of working class feminist politics.
Don't know if you it's my comment, if you want to tread here. Comment, please,
Yeah.
on the support of Trump by educated white women.
Well, it's not up for debate, is it? I mean, I think in both elections, right, in 2016 and in 2020, white, educated, middle-class women, a majority of them supported Trump. The same is true if we look at like Georgia's gubernatorial campaign. Something like 82% of white women supported Brian Kemp. And I think that is, I think when I talked about the surprise, so the headlines, right? It's like, oh my gosh, how could white women do that? And I think that speaks to a really sort of homogenous view of white women's politics, right? And I felt that same way. I'm like, oh my gosh. And yet I knew, right? I had 20 years of work that would have suggested that a large number of white women would have supported that level of politics, right? I mean, that brand of politics. And so I think that we remain surprised is because we imagine that women have a sort of core set of real women have a different set of politics than the women that are supporting the anti-immigration, white nationalist politics of Trump. And I think the history tells us that that's just not true, right? That there have been, even from the suffrage movement, right? That there were some of the leading suffragists in the 19th century, right? Adopted white supremacist politics and didn't believe Black men should get the right to vote. And so I think that, you know, I guess I'm also curious, why is it that we're surprised that white women voted for Donald Trump and we're not surprised that white men voted for Donald Trump? Why don't we ask that question, right? Why don't we ask, why are we not as mystified by an American electorate that at this point, right, we know would have voted for somebody who, and I don't want to be like partisan, but someone who, like, by sort of overwhelming evidence, didn't really care about the US Constitution. So I think that, you know, we ask this question about women because we imagine women bring this sort of moral barometer to politics, and I think that's just not true. It's true of some, and it's not true of others.
Well, Elizabeth, I think we'll close tonight thanking you through one of the people online. She says, this has been fabulous. She is amazing, insightful, honest, fearless historian. So anyway, but we do thank you very much for talking with us tonight. You've certainly stimulated a lot of ideas and more history reading, I think. And thank you.
Thank you all. And Brooke has my email if you want to ask a question or continue a conversation, not in such a public forum. I'm happy to do that as well. Thank you so much.
I will give them your email. Thank you.
Yes.
Good
Okay.
night.
Thanks. Good night.
Bring up the